The day they threw me out was October 17, 1888. My 18th birthday. It was a Tuesday, with a sky the color of a dull slate and a wind that promised a cold night. Mr. Finch, the supervisor of the Bixby Home for Unwanted Boys, didn't bother with ceremony. He called me into his office, a cramped room that always smelled of stale pipe smoke and judgment. Through the thin glass of the door, I could see the other boys, the ones who were still just numbers on a ledger, pretending not to watch. They were watching. Mr. Finch sat behind his heavy oak desk, a fortress of his own importance, and steepled his fingers. His face was a map of disapproval I had spent a decade learning to navigate. "Well, Samuel," he began, his voice dry as dust, "the county's obligation to you has concluded. You are, as of this morning, a man. And a man is his own problem." He slid a thin envelope across the polished wood. "This arrived for you some weeks ago. From a lawyer in town. It seems you have an inheritance." A few of the boys outside snickered. An inheritance was a fantasy, a story we told ourselves in the dark of the dormitory to imagine a life beyond these walls. Mr. Finch allowed himself a small, cruel smile. "Don't get your hopes up. It is, by all accounts, a joke." He leaned forward, the chair groaning under his weight, and delivered the line that would become the foundation of my life. "Some boys are built for purpose. You, Samuel, are just built to take up space. Now, gather your things. Your space is needed." I didn't say a word. I took the envelope, my hand steady, and walked out of the office. The laughter was quiet but sharp. I packed my few belongings, a spare shirt, a worn book of poems, and a whetstone, into a small cloth sack. I didn't look at anyone as I left. I walked straight to the lawyer's office, the envelope feeling heavy and hot in my hand. Mr. Clark, the lawyer, was a kinder man, but weary. He explained that a great-uncle I'd never known, a man considered eccentric to the point of madness, had died and left me his only possession, a deed to 40 acres of worthless land in the foothills. "It's mostly rock and scrub, son," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "The county values it at less than $1. And there's a cave on the property. The deed specifies that the entrance was sealed upon his death. It's yours now. The lock, the stone, all of it." He handed me a single, heavy iron key. It felt ancient, a piece of some forgotten machine. A worthless patch of rock and a sealed hole in the ground. Mr. Finch was right. It was a joke. But as I stood on the dusty street, the key cold in my palm, a vow formed in my heart, silent and absolute. I would go to that place. I would take that joke and I would build a life from it. I would build something from the nothing they gave me, and I would never, ever go back. The walk out of town was a lesson in insignificance. The neat grid of streets gave way to a rutted track, and then to nothing but the vast, indifferent expanse of the high desert. The sun was a weak spot in the grey sky, offering no warmth. I had a small loaf of bread and a canteen of water, a pitiful defense against the scale of the landscape. Every gust of wind felt like a personal insult, trying to push me back toward the town I had just renounced. It took me the better part of the day to find the property marker, a simple iron stake driven into the ground next to a pile of rocks. The land was exactly as the lawyer described, a sloping graveyard of granite and creosote bush. And there, set into the base of a low mesa, was the cave. It wasn't a natural opening. The entrance was a perfect arch, about 7 feet high, filled in with dark, expertly mortared stones. Set into the very center of the stonework was a thick iron door, its surface pitted with rust. A heavy, intricate lock was bolted to it. This was my inheritance. A wall. I tried the key. It fit, but the lock was frozen solid with rust and disuse. I put my shoulder to the door and pushed, then again, my boot slipping on the loose shale. It didn't move. It was as firm as the mountain itself. As dusk began to bleed across the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The wind grew teeth. I had no tent, no bedroll, only the thin coat on my back. I gathered what little brushwood I could find and tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp and the wind stole the flame before it could catch. The first night was a brutal education in failure. I huddled against the rock face, trying to find a spot sheltered from the wind, my body shaking uncontrollably. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that seeped through my clothes and into my bones. Every star that emerged in the clear, black sky felt like a cold, distant eye, watching me die. In the deepest, darkest hours before dawn, I understood the choice before me. I could wait for morning, then crawl back to town, defeated. I could beg Mr. Finch for a place on the floor, trade my freedom for a bowl of thin soup and a roof. Or I could stay. I could face this wall of rock and iron and find a way through it. The humiliation of returning was a fire in my gut, the only source of heat I had. I would not go back. I would get inside that cave, or I would die here, on its doorstep. The cold was a crucible, burning away everything but that single, stubborn resolve. This place was mine. I would claim it. Dawn arrived thin and grey, mercy in the form of weak light. My limbs were stiff, my face numb, but I was alive. I spent the morning circling the base of the mesa, my eyes scanning every inch of the rock face. The stonework was seamless, a testament to the builder's skill. The iron door was a fortress gate. There was no obvious weakness. I ate half the loaf of bread, drank sparingly from my canteen, and kept searching. It was a kind of prayer, a desperate act of faith that my predecessor had left another way in. Late in the afternoon, high above the sealed entrance, I saw it. A dark rectangle against the lighter rock, no bigger than a small window. It looked like a shadow, but it was too perfect, too square. A ventilation shaft. Getting to it was a new kind of misery. The rock face was steep and treacherous, offering few handholds. I fell twice, tearing my trousers and scraping my hands raw. My fingers, still numb from the cold, fumbled for purchase. But the thought of another night in the open was a spur, driving me upward. Finally, I pulled myself onto the narrow ledge beside the opening. It was covered with a heavy iron grate, bolted directly into the stone. I used my whetstone, the only tool I had, to laboriously scrape away the dirt and rust from the bolt heads. They were old, but they were not fused. I used the flat edge of the stone as a makeshift wrench, turning them a fraction of an inch at a time. It took hours. My muscles screamed, and sweat stung my eyes. As the sun began to set, the last bolt came free. I lifted the heavy grate and looked down into absolute darkness. The air that rose from the shaft was cool but not frigid, and it smelled of damp earth and something else, something clean and metallic. This was it. I slid my legs into the hole, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was a tight fit. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was stuck, but I exhaled and squeezed through, my shirt catching and tearing. I dropped 10 feet, landing hard on a packed dirt floor. The blackness was total, disorienting. I fumbled in my sack for a match. The first one sputtered and died. The second one flared to life, a tiny, precious sun. I held it up. I was not in a cave. I was in a room. The walls were smooth, carved from the rock itself. Directly in front of me was a workbench, and on it sat a lantern, its glass chimney clean, its reservoir full of oil. My hands trembled as I lit the wick. A warm, steady glow pushed back the darkness, and I saw what my great-uncle had built. It was a workshop, a pantry, a home. Shelves lined the walls, filled with tools, neatly labeled jars, and leather-bound books. Crates were stacked in orderly columns. In the center of the room, a deep channel was cut into the stone floor, covered by wooden planks. I lifted one. Below, clean water flowed with a gentle murmur. This wasn't a tomb. It was an engine. A meticulously designed system for living. Standing there in the lantern light, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of hidden work, I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't the worthless land. It was this. This secret, beautiful, impossible place. And the key was not for the door outside, but for the life waiting within. The next few weeks were a blur of discovery and labor. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization of one. The first thing I found, placed deliberately on the workbench beside the lantern, was a set of journals. There were 7 of them, bound in thick leather, their pages filled with a small, precise script and intricate diagrams. They were the operating manual for my new world. My great-uncle, a man named Thomas, had been an engineer, disgraced for his radical ideas about water conservation and geothermal energy. Cast out by his peers, he had come to this piece of forgotten land and dedicated the last 40 years of his life to proving them wrong. He wrote not with bitterness, but with a calm, methodical passion. The journals revealed the cave's secrets. It was not a single chamber, but a network of them, excavated and expanded over decades. The steady flow of water in the floor channel was no accident. He had discovered a deep, slow-seeping aquifer, a hidden river inside the mountain. He had spent years devising a system of cisterns and gravity-fed pipes, all carved from the rock itself, to capture every precious drop. But the water was only half of the system. He had also located a deep geothermal vent that kept the innermost chambers at a constant, mild temperature, even in the dead of winter. It was a hidden lung of the earth, breathing warmth into the stone. His ultimate creation, the one that filled the final 2 journals, was a subterranean greenhouse. In a vast chamber deep inside the mountain, he had built a series of terraced planting beds. Above them, he had installed a complex array of polished copper sheets and precisely angled glass panels near small, hidden shafts to the outside. It was designed to capture the faintest ambient light and reflect it down onto the soil, concentrating it, turning starlight and moonlight into a pale, ghostly energy source for his crops. I began the work of recommissioning the system. It was grueling. I cleared decades of fine dust from the water channels, tightened the fittings on the copper pipes, and cleaned every single glass panel until it shone. I felt a strange connection to this man I'd never met, my hands following the paths his had worn smooth. I lived on the food he had left behind, jars of dried beans, sacks of flour, and smoked meats that were still perfectly preserved in the cool, dry air. In one of his earliest entries, Thomas had written a line that I read over and over until it was etched into my mind. Scarcity is a failure of imagination. He believed the desert wasn't empty, but merely misunderstood. He saw abundance where others saw only lack. As I worked, alone in the quiet hum of the mountain, I began to understand. I wasn't just fixing his machine, I was learning his philosophy. The world outside could be harsh and unforgiving, a place that threw boys away. But in here, in the quiet dark, governed by principles of patience and observation, I could build something that would last. The first true test came in the dead of winter. Outside, the world was buried in snow and ice, but deep within the cave, the air remained a steady 55 degrees. The time had come to see if the theory worked. Following Thomas's detailed instructions, I prepared one of the terrace soil beds, mixing in nutrients he had composted and stored in sealed bins. The soil was rich and dark, a startling contrast to the pale rock that surrounded it. From his seed library, a heavy wooden chest filled with hundreds of small, labeled packets, I chose the hardiest varieties, a type of pale, fibrous potato, a tough-leafed cabbage, and a variety of been bred for low-light conditions. Planting them felt like a sacred act, an absurd gesture of hope in the heart of a stone. I diverted a small, steady trickle of water to the bed through a network of smaller channels Thomas had engineered. Then, I began the wait. Every day, I would go into the greenhouse chamber and inspect the soil, my lantern held high. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Doubt began to creep in. Perhaps the seeds were too old. Perhaps the faint, reflected light from the panels was not enough. Perhaps this whole enterprise was the magnificent folly of a madman. I started to feel the weight of my isolation, the silence of the cave pressing in. I was a boy in a box, playing a dead man's game. Then, one morning, I saw it. A tiny spear of green, no bigger than my thumbnail, pushing its way through the dark soil. I knelt, my breath catching in my throat. It was a cabbage shoot. A few feet away, another. And then the pale, twin leaves of a bin plant. Life. It was a miracle. A defiant, impossible miracle in the absolute dark. That single green shoot changed everything. It wasn't just food, it was proof. proof that the system worked, that Thomas was a genius, and that I, Samuel, the boy who was built to take up space, could bring forth life from stone. A new feeling began to grow inside me, something more potent than mere survival. It was competence. It was purpose. That spring, when the snows melted, I ventured back into town for the first time. I needed salt and new boots. I walked with a different posture. I was no longer a cast-off, but a steward. In the general store, an old man with a face like a dried apple and hands gnarled from a lifetime of hard work watched me. His name was Henry, a retired miner who now lived on a small claim outside of town. He saw the new calluses on my hands, the way I moved with a quiet economy. He followed me outside. "You're that boy," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The one who took the old hermit's plot," I nodded. "I live there." He squinted at me, his gaze sharp and knowing. He didn't ask about the sealed door or the rumors. He just pointed a crooked finger at my hands. "Those aren't the hands of an idle boy. You look like a man who's building something that'll last longer than he will. You ever need to learn how to read a storm coming or find water on the surface, you come find me. A man who works with rock ought to know the sky, too." It was the first time anyone had looked at me and seen a builder. The next year, the drought began. It started slowly, a dry spring turning into a rainless summer. The town creek shrank to a muddy trickle. The ranchers' wells, dug for a wetter time, began to run low. Dust became a constant feature of life, a fine powder that coated everything and gritted in your teeth. Up in my mountain, the aquifer flowed as steady and reliable as time itself. My subterranean gardens flourished. I had rows of potatoes, cabbages, and beans, and was experimenting with carrots and onions. I had more than I could ever eat myself. I began trading the surplus in town, quietly, for things I couldn't make: cloth, lamp oil, metal wire. At first, people were just grateful. But as the drought worsened, gratitude curdled into suspicion. Whispers followed me down the main street. "The boy from the orphanage, living on that cursed rock pile. How does he have fresh vegetables when our own gardens are withered to dust? He must have found a secret spring. He's a water hoarder." The fear of scarcity makes people mean. One hot afternoon in late August, a delegation of 3 men rode up to my property. I recognized the man in the lead, a rancher named Miller whose land bordered mine. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed with resentment. "We need to talk," he said, not bothering with a greeting. He dismounted, his spurs jingling in the unnerving silence. "The whole valley is drying up. People are talking about packing up and leaving. And yet, you're bringing in produce like it's the wettest spring on record. We hear you got water to spare." It was a direct challenge. A moral test. My first instinct was to retreat. To go back inside, bar the door I had since managed to open from within, and protect the sanctuary I had built. Thomas's journals were full of warnings about the jealousy of small-minded men. This place was my survival, my entire world. But then I remembered his core principle: scarcity is a failure of imagination. Hoarding the water would be the ultimate failure of that principle. It would be an admission that I was no different from them, ruled by fear. I looked at their hard, desperate faces. I saw not malice, but thirst. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "I have water. Let me show you." I led them to the now unsealed entrance and lit a lantern. Their skepticism was a palpable thing as they stepped into the cool darkness. I walked them through the system, showing them the main cistern, the network of channels, the steady, patient flow from the deep earth. I showed them the gardens, the rows of healthy plants growing under the pale, reflected light. They were silent, their expression shifting from suspicion to dumbfounded awe. When we returned to the surface, Miller looked at me, his posture different, his aggression gone. "I don't understand it," he mumbled. "It's impossible. It's just engineering," I replied. "And I'll make you a deal. I will give you a share of the water. Not sell it. Give it. But you have to help. Help me dig the irrigation ditches to bring it down to the lower fields. Help me build a reservoir on the surface. We will share the water, but we will also share the work. It was a choice. Generosity over fear. Community over isolation. In the silence that followed, I knew that whatever they decided, my own path was now clear. My offer split the town. Some, like Miller, were humbled and immediately agreed. They saw the logic, the hope. They began arriving the next day with shovels and picks, ready to work. Others remained deeply suspicious. They muttered about unnatural things, about tampering with the earth. They saw my gift not as generosity, but as a trick, a way to gain power over them. They preferred their familiar misery to an unfamiliar solution. It was during this time that I met Ms. Albright. She was the town school teacher, a woman in her late 30s with a quick, curious mind and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She wasn't interested in the politics or the gossip, she was fascinated by the mechanics of my system. She arrived one afternoon with a notepad and a dozen questions. "Mr. Miller told me what you've built," she said, her tone direct and respectful. "He described it as magic. I suspect it's something far more interesting. With applied science, she was the first person who saw the cave not as a hideout or a secret hoard, but as a blueprint. She became my collaborator. While I managed the physical expansion of the irrigation system with Miller's crew, she spent her evenings with me in the cave, poring over Thomas's journals. Her handwriting was far more legible than mine, and her understanding of geometry and physics was leagues ahead. Together, we translated Thomas's dense, academic notes into clear, practical instructions. We redrew his diagrams, adding labels and explanations. Ms. Albright saw the larger potential immediately. "This isn't just about this one mountain, Samuel," she said one evening, her face lit by the lantern glow. "This is a method. A set of principles. What if there are other places like this? Other hidden aquifers, other sources of geothermal heat? People are abandoning their land because they think it's worthless. What if they just don't know how to look?" She proposed we create a pamphlet. A small, cheaply printed booklet that would explain the basics of what Thomas had discovered, how to read the geology, how to look for signs of deep water, how to engineer a low-light greenhouse. It would be called The Stone Garden, a guide to farming without rain. My system was about to stop being my secret and start being a public idea. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. We worked for weeks, writing and rewriting, drawing and redrawing. We used my surplus produce to pay the printer in the next county. When the first 100 copies arrived, they felt heavier than lead. We were no longer just surviving a drought, we were actively fighting it with knowledge. We were turning a private sanctuary into a public good. The drought held its grip on the land for 2 more years. Our irrigation project, fed by the mountain's deep wellspring, created a ribbon of green in the parched valley. We had water, and we had food. But beyond our small oasis, the world was turning to dust. My friend Henry, the old miner, was hit the hardest. His small claim was high and dry, his well nothing but a stone-lined pit of cracked mud. He was a proud man, too proud to join the public works, too stubborn to leave the little shack he'd built with his own hands. I started carrying water up to him every few days, a couple of heavy buckets at a time. He'd accept it with a gruff nod, his gratitude buried under layers of pride. "Shouldn't have to be this way," he'd grumble. "The earth shouldn't turn on a man." I saw him getting weaker. The heat and the poor diet were wearing him down. The town doctor visited once and just shook his head. There was nothing to be done for a body that was simply running out of time and resources. One evening, I found him sitting on his porch, looking out at the sunset painting the dusty sky in shades of orange and purple. He was whittling a piece of wood, something he did when his thoughts were heavy. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. He pressed his prospecting tools into my hands, a geologist's hammer and a set of fine chisels. "You'll have more use for these than I will," he said, his voice a faint whisper. "I spent my whole life breaking rocks, looking for gold. Never found much. You listen to the rock. You find the life in it. Not the gold. The life. That's the real treasure, boy. Don't you ever forget it, he died 2 days later. His death hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't a failure of the system, I couldn't irrigate his entire claim by myself, but it felt like a personal failure of scale. My purpose had been focused on my own survival, then on my immediate community. Henry's quiet passing expanded my sense of responsibility. It wasn't enough to save one valley. The drought was a beast with 1,000 mouths, and it was devouring families and communities all across the territory. The pamphlets Ms. Albright and I had made suddenly felt more urgent than ever. They weren't just a curious scientific document anymore. They were a weapon. They were a lifeline. Henry's death clarified my mission. I had been given a gift, a legacy of knowledge from a man I never knew, and validated by a man I had come to respect. Now, the debt had to be paid forward. The work wasn't about me anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to watch their world turn to dust while life-giving water flowed, silent and untapped, just beneath their feet. The years began to move faster after that, marked not by birthdays but by seasons of progress. The year is 1895. The Great Drought has broken, but the memory of it has permanently altered the landscape of our thinking. Our pamphlet, once a local curiosity, has found its way into the hands of homesteaders, geologists, and even government surveyors. People started looking at the earth differently. They began to see the subtle signs Thomas had written about, the specific types of rock formations, the patterns of hardy vegetation, the slight temperature variations in the soil. They started digging, not for gold, but for the deep, slow water. Our project became a school. Men and women traveled for hundreds of miles to learn the principles of the stone garden. I was no longer the strange boy who lived in a cave, they called me the waterman. I taught them how to build the light-capturing systems, how to manage the airflow from geothermal vents, how to create stable, nutrient-rich soil in contained environments. Miller, the rancher who had once confronted me with suspicion, was now my partner, managing the surface-level reservoirs and distribution network that provided water for dozens of families. Ms. Albright went on to write a proper book, a detailed scientific text that earned her a position at a new state university. Her work gave our practical knowledge and institutional legitimacy we never could have achieved alone. One day, a young woman named Anna arrived with a group of learners. She had lost her family farm in a neighboring territory to the same drought that had nearly destroyed us. There was a quiet strength about her, a resilience that I recognized. She didn't have the engineering mind of Ms. Albright or the raw physical strength of Miller, but she had a gift for organization and for teaching. She saw the human system behind the mechanical one. She stayed, first helping to manage the seed library, then to coordinate the teaching schedules. We built a life together, not one of high romance, but one of shared purpose and mutual respect. We were two people who had been overlooked by the world, finding our value in useful work. The past returned only once. An old, stooped man arrived in town and asked to see the project. It was Mr. Finch. The orphanage had been closed for years, its purpose made obsolete by a changing world. He looked frail and lost. I walked him through the vast network of tunnels and greenhouses, the quiet hum of water and life, a stark contrast to the stale silence of his old office. He said nothing, his eyes wide with a kind of bewildered disbelief. He couldn't comprehend how the boy built to take up space had managed to create so much of it. He never offered an apology, not in words. But as he stood at the entrance, about to leave, he looked at me and simply said, "I don't understand if it was enough." It was a confession. He had spent his life managing scarcity, believing it was the fundamental rule of the world. He couldn't imagine a reality built on anything else. I am an old man now. My hands are not as steady as they once were, but they still know the feel of stone and soil. I stand with Anna at the entrance to the cave, the same entrance that was once a sealed iron door, a symbol of a worthless inheritance. Now, it is the gateway to the most productive farmland in the territory. The system has grown beyond Thomas's wildest dreams, a sprawling network of underground farms and reservoirs that has made this entire region not just survivable, but prosperous. We measure our legacy not in dollars, but in the things that truly matter, in the hundreds of families that stayed on their land, in the thousands of acres reclaimed from the desert, in the letters we receive from distant places where people are building their own stone gardens. The knowledge has become common wisdom now, passed from one farmer to the next. The thesis I first read in a dead man's journal has become the central truth of my life, proven over and over again. Scarcity is a failure of imagination. We proved that what one man could build in secret, a community could perfect in the open. We proved that generosity is a more powerful force for survival than hoarding. We learned that the harshest landscapes often hold the most profound secrets, waiting for someone stubborn enough to look. The world will always have its gatekeepers, the Mr. Finches who tell you what you are and what you are not, who hand you a key to a locked door and call it a joke. They will define you by your limitations. They will tell you that the world is a place of finite resources and that you are not entitled to a share. They will build walls and tell you it is for your own good. But the earth holds deeper truths. What door have they sealed for you? What inheritance did they tell you was worthless, a joke not worth your time? What part of your world have you been told is barren, empty, and without purpose? And what are you going to build inside it, once you find your own way into the dark?